this is going to be your space to be stress-free. So I want you to start thinking of ABA as something that's fun, right? We don't want it to be something aversive. So if you're studying for your exam, if you just got a promotion, if you're way in over your head because you're a brand new BCBA, ABA might not be your bestie right now. But we're going to change that through a series of these bite-sized videos that are gonna help you see ABA in everyday life and just make sense instead of stress you out and think, what is this? Description. So basically what you can observe. So think back to when you were in elementary school and you were getting ready to pick a science experiment, right? I'm sure there were a couple of things that you wanted to do that mom and dad were like, well, no, we can't do that. Why? Because there's no way to describe, right? Put any data from what we're observing to be able to conduct this experiment in the first place. So description has to do with the observer, right? You. What can you see? What is happening? What's going on? Things that anybody else in the room with you would also be able to describe in the same way so that you can take that information and compare it to other facts and information that we have available. So prediction is what happens after multiple descriptive observances. So first we have our description. And now we're moving on to prediction. So again, if we're talking about a science experiment, let's say you're trying to figure out what type of gum is going to give you the largest bubble. So we don't really see a lot of these low sugar, no sugar gums being able to pop big bubbles, but all the kid gums that are full of sugar and high fructose corn syrup would be the ones that probably make the bigger bubbles. So you're predicting based on what you've observed before or data that you've collected that one event, content of sugar in gum, is going to make a difference in the size of the bubble. Moving on to control, which is the third and highest level of scientific understanding. So back to our science experiment. Let's say you love avocados and you're trying to figure out how you can prevent the other half of the avocado from turning brown. So you're going to control what happens to the avocado. So maybe the first avocado, you just throw it in a Ziploc bag and put it in the fridge. The other one, you put in a bowl with water in it and you cover it and throw it in the fridge. And the third one, you get one of those fancy wax papers and put it over and throw it in the fridge. So now you have control over what happens to the avocado, which leads to functional relationships and is the first baby brick of ABA that we see. So wrapping up, control is what leads to functional relations in ABA. Functional relationships is what all of this is about, right? So we have that control. We are causing or preventing one event from occurring because we have control over this event. So something super simple. If I walk into my bathroom, I want to turn the water on. I know that in order to control, I just have to turn the faucet on and water will come out. There's control over whether or not water comes out of the sink when I turn that lever. So functional relationships are what is going to help us in ABA to control behavior. So continuing on page 4, chapter 1, we're moving on to the attitudes and assumptions of science. There are 6 attitudes of science: empiricism, experimentation, replication, determinism, parsimony, and philosophical doubt. Empiricism. This one is big in ABA and it ties in further along with one of the 7 dimensions of ABA. But for now, empiricism, you ought to think back of when you're taking science classes, right? Empirical evidence. What is that? Facts, numbers, temperatures, lengths. So empiricism are things that you are able to observe so you can see and measure and everybody can agree on. A great example for this is the fit community. What are they always talking about? My macros, my protein, my carbs, the number of hours I slept. So when they're comparing protein powders, all of that is objective, right? 40 grams is 40 grams. But when you talk about what's the best tasting protein powder, then you get into opinions. So remember, empiricism, empirical facts. Experimentation. Again, science in ABA. So experimentation just means that we're using multiple experiments to prove that one event or one variable actually changes something, right? So if you're trying to bake the best bread and you're tweaking the yeast, the amount of yeast that you put, but everything else stays exactly the same, then you are manipulating that variable, the yeast, to see how good the bread comes out, right? So based on that, you're making a functional relationship. And in behavior, we have functional relationships where we determine that an environmental variable has an effect on a specific behavior. So we get a functional analysis. Replication. This is big, especially if you're trying to get a research study published in one of the journals in our field. So you need to be able to replicate this intervention. This is how we get all of our evidence-based interventions that we implement throughout ABA with all of our learners and clients. So if it cannot be replicated, we don't care about it. Why? Because ABA is a science, right? And the first thing we want to be able to do is, cool, you're able to prove that this is happening under this condition with this individual. Can you replicate it? How many times can it be replicated? The more it is able to replicate and be able to give you the same result, the stronger that intervention is going to be. Replication. So determinism basically means that everything that occurs and takes place in the world is based on some sort of law and order. So Cooper talks about fatalism and accidentalism, which would be great if you are an author and you're writing fantasy romance novels. So this is where we get like fated mates. Oh my gosh, they're fated mates. They're meant to be, or they accidentally fell in love. They accidentally got married. Bring it back to reality, right? This doesn't happen in the real world. You have to follow laws and orders to get married. So that's all it means, that we are not going to just assume that things happen out of nowhere. Parsimony. Basically, we're going to keep it as simple as possible. We're talking basic needs first. So are we looking at, are they hungry? Are they tired? Are they thirsty, right? Cover your basic needs and then move on to the immediate environment. Are they wearing shoes that are too tight for them, that are causing them pain? Do they have a tag that's digging into their skin? That's very irritating. They don't know how to communicate functionally, so they're screaming and they're crying to try to let you know that, hey, something's not right. And then you can move on to, okay, ruled everything out. Is it medical? Do they have a cold? Do they have the flu, right? Maybe parents didn't tell you that they were sick or that they threw up last night. Happens all the time. So is it a medical necessity, right? Something going on that they need to get fixed. And then you can move on to the function of the behavior. Philosophical doubt. This is a big one. I know it's in chapter 1, but we really do need to be better about applying it in the field of ABA after you become a BCBA. Don't become one of those BCBAs that's like, I'm the BCBA and I know better, and don't give your RBTs or your staff an explanation of why you're doing something, why the client is not making progress, why it's been 3 months and you haven't seen a change, right? You need to do better as a provider, as a clinician, and use that philosophical doubt. Let's open our minds and think, okay, maybe I was wrong, or maybe the environment changed and now it's no longer attention seeking, but it's escape, right? So we're starting off with a brief history of behavior analysis. And basically what Cooper is saying, that in order to better understand applied behavior analysis, we're going to split it up into 3 different parts. So the first one being the philosophy of science of behavior, the second one being the basic research of behavior, and then the third one is the application of that research, the technology used to advance in the field of ABA. We start discussing Watson and how he was the first one in the 20th century to go ahead and define psychology as a science of behavior, right? So before Watson came along, everyone pretty much was like, oh, psychology is all about inner thoughts and a state of consciousness and other mental processes, very mentalistic way of thinking. But Watson was the first one who was like, no, it's observable, it's measurable, it's actually a science, a natural science of behavior. But then he kind of fudged it up, right? So he went on to say that given 12 babies, he would pick one at random, and because of the science of behavior, he would be able to basically mold them into any kind of a specialist that he wanted, be it like a tennis player or a lawyer or a doctor, right? And then at the end, he claimed that, yes, he didn't really have the scientific backup to prove it, but that a lot of people had been doing it this way. So this kind of goes with the whole like, but this is how it's always been done, so it should be fine way of thinking. So because of that, even though he did bring around the stimulus response psychology, a lot of people nowadays will go back to what he claimed and use what he said, even though it was, you know, back in the first decade of the 20th century, and discredit behaviorism because they focus on what he said. So what is stimulus response psychology? Watson believed that psychology was not internal mental processes, but what was observable. So we were talking about the stimulus and the environment and the response that it evokes. So stimulus, response, psychology. But he couldn't explain behavior, all behavior, by things that were observable in that sense. So even though he didn't get it entirely correct, Watson and the stimulus response psychology is basically the first step to ABA, experimental analysis of behavior. And this was brought on by Skinner, and he birthed the respondent and operant behavior. So when you think about respondent behavior, we're talking about reflexes, okay? So things that, like when you go to the doctor and they hit you on the knee and you're like jerks up, that is a reflex, right? You can't control it. When, for example, you go to the eye doctor and they blow air into your eye, you can't really control it. It's just automatic, right? A reflex. I know they tell you don't close your eyes, try not to close your eyes, and then you're like trying not to blink or like one eye's twitching. It's a reflex. So, and then we move off to operant behavior, right? Which is the most important one, because operant behavior relies on the behavior being controlled by what comes after, whereas respondent behavior is just a reflex and it's based on the antecedent. Operant behavior, little operation of what happens after the behavior that controls it. So this little operation, the three-term contingency, focuses on consequences and not antecedents, right? So the behavior is occurring because of multiple past experiences. So if a baby's crying and mom comes and picks up the baby cries more often to get picked up. Why? Because it's been reinforced in the past, because of the consequence, because it is something that takes place after the behavior. So the behavior will continue to occur as it is reinforced by the consequence. So now we move on to radical behaviorism. And here Skinner talks about how we have in psychology, because it used to be mentalistic, and to this day there's a lot of fields in psychology that are still very mentalistic, just not behaviorism, just not radical behaviorism, right? Talks about hypothetical constructs and explanatory fictions, right? So hypothetical constructs are just things you might assume, words are hard today, assume as happening, right? But you can't observe. There's no way to determine if that is really correct or incorrect, right? So you're assuming something is happening, you're presuming something is happening, but there is no way to actually prove it. There are no facts. Explanatory fiction is basically a roundabout way of describing something. So you see this a lot when you use a word to describe something where you're like, what is sticky, right? And you're like, oh, well, a sticky is when something sticks to something. Like it's sticky, you know, that sticky is because it's sticking together. So you have literally not provided any further information to actively describe what sticky is. You're just going a roundabout way of trying to explain sticky by using stickiness or sticking or stickies, right? Roundabout way. You're not being very clear. So don't judge me. I can't pronounce it. It's either methodological or methodological. But that kind of behaviorism doesn't bother with inner thoughts or any type of personal events. They just push it to the side when it comes to behaviorism. So the science of behavior for them, they don't take any of those things into account. Whereas radical behaviorism, if you're a radical behaviorist, you do take those personal thoughts and inner events into account. We also apply the science of behavior to them. So we try to analyze and learn and observe them, because that person who is going through those things are able to and are capable to tell us what those inner things and thoughts are. Applied. So basically this means that the target behaviors that we're working on are going to make a significant improvement in the learner's quality of life. So what can this look like? If you have an individual who's trying to get a job but is unable to fill out the application forms, that's something you can work on. If you are looking at a child who's always dreamed of being on the soccer team but doesn't have the communication skills to collaborate with team members, that's a skill you can work on. If you're looking at an individual that wants to date but does not know how to engage in reciprocal conversation, that would be a skill that would work on. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a maladaptive or challenging behavior. It can be another skill that's just going to improve their everyday life. Behavioral. So obviously we're going to have behavior and applied behavior analysis. But there's a few important things about the behavior that we're going to actually study and manipulate. The behavior needs to be something that needs to either increase or decrease. And as we already talked about with applied, it needs to be socially significant and make an actual improvement in the learner's quality of life. It also needs to be measurable. So it needs to be something that you can actually take data on, because it is, again, part of science where we would need to make observations and take measurements to determine whether or not our interventions are actually increasing or decreasing the behavior, as well as making sure that it's not just the observer who is making changes or making it seem like there is or is not any change based on the intervention. Analytic, where we want to be able to prove that we actually have control over the behavior through a functional relationship. So this is why it's very important when you're conducting FBAs that you're able to determine the function and then create preventative, replacement, and consequence strategies that are function-based, right? Because we want to have that functional relationship so that we can have control over this behavior, so that we can either increase it if need be or decrease it if it's something that is harming the individual and their quality of life. Technological. So this one is Something that I always use the little instructions in the Lego packets as an example, because I am absolutely horrible at making those little Lego things. I can't do it. It takes me a really long time. I don't have the skills or patience to do them, but if you give me enough time, I will eventually figure it out. Why? Because the instructions are detailed. It comes with a picture. It's like step 1, step 2. So essentially, when you are writing interventions or behavior plans, treatment plans, you want to make sure that it's technological enough, like reading a recipe and being able to follow a recipe, so that any person who sees it can also implement it. So if you have a team of RBTs or a team of staff members, doesn't matter, because they can all follow the same instruction. Effective. So great, we are targeting behaviors that are socially significant, that are going to actually make a change in our learners' lives, right? But how do we determine if they're actually effective? Like, are they making an actual change in their lives? Are we teaching them communication skills with peers that they're actually going to generalize outside of the clinic setting, outside of the one-to-ones, outside of the session at home? Are they actively using the skills that you taught, right, and that you increased in a controlled environment, on the playground, at a birthday party, at grandma and grandpa's during Christmas when they have to meet all of their cousins and aunts and uncles, right? So we want to make sure that we are actually making a significant change in progress so that it is effective for the learner. Generality. So I kind of jumped the gun there with effective, because generalization is the learner able to also engage in these new behaviors, replacement behaviors, or reduced behaviors across different environments and time, right? So a lot of kiddos that you'll see are like doing amazing and they do great and they move from baseline to intervention, and they get generalization, and then you hit weekly maintenance or monthly maintenance, and all of a sudden those 80s, 90s, and 100s drop to 0. Why? Because there's no generality. They're not generalizing those skills. They're not sticking with them. They haven't really fully learned them, which is why it's important to consider the mastery criteria. What are you doing? Are you doing 90% across 5 consecutive sessions? Are you doing 80% across 3 consecutive sessions? That also has a lot to do into how much they retain. Conceptually systematic. So basically this means that we're always going to take interventions and start off with the basic principles of ABA. We're always going to start off following all of these interventions that we know work, that have been reproduced through evidence-based procedures and research, and have always given the same result. And from those interventions, then we can go ahead and tweak it, right? Because we want all these interventions that we apply for our learners to be individualized. So we want to make sure we're using ABA, basic principles, and then we can tweak them for an individual or learner to make progress for a behavior, to change the behavior. We're not just going to make up stuff because we're behavior analysts. So wrapping up, as practitioners of ABA, we want to make sure that we're held accountable for our actions, right? So like when you go to the doctor and the doctor gives you a medication because he thinks you have a cold, he's not going to give you something for diabetes, right? He's going to stick to a cold medication. If that one doesn't work, then he'll give you a different brand or strain of the cold medication, right? Same thing with ABA. We want to stick to the basic principles of ABA and then tweak them as we go along, so that they're individualized for our learner. We want to make sure that if we make a mistake and something's not working, that it's okay. It's a science. We're just going to move on to the next intervention that is going to possibly help either increase or decrease his behavior until we find the good fit for the learner. It's super important for ABA to follow the science of behavior so that we can make these significant changes in these people's lives, not just the individual getting the treatment, but the people in their immediate environment. We want these things to help them so that all of their lives increase. We want to help them so that they have a better quality of life, not end up hurting them by implementing things that are not ABA or are things that you would not do in public, right, in front of a judge or a police officer or even your parents or the learner's parents. We have a duty, an ethical duty as behavior analysts to use the science of behavior to improve and help others and not bring them down and hurt them. ABA should also be empowering and optimistic. Why? Because the whole point we're studying behavior is to make a socially significant change. So it should empower the individuals that are actually getting this treatment, as well as the caregivers, the staff, and the teachers that are working with them that are implementing these interventions. Can you imagine working with somebody and implementing ABA and not showing a change? That would be really frustrating. It would be overwhelming sometimes and would just be disheartening if you're a parent that's been on the wait list for years waiting to start ABA services so that there's a significant change to help your child and you can't see an improvement. So it's super important that ABA follows the basic principles of ABA and that it is studied and changed to make improvement so that we can give hope to these parents and individuals that are getting service. One of the best things that you'll see as a behavior analyst is empowering your staff and your caregivers and seeing them improve with their work, as well as see the optimism and hope for future goals to be met through the science of behavior. So I hope you enjoyed this Behavior Bite video. Stay tuned. I will be back next week with a brand new chapter. Enjoy the rest of your day. See you later.